This lecture is about sustainability, economics, and equity. It's from Environmental Science for AP, Chapter 20, and this will be Module 65 and 66. So first of all, we need to review the topic of externalities. This is covered briefly in Chapter 20. It's a review of something that's covered in Chapter 10, if you need to go look that up. So an externality is a cost or benefit of a good or service that is not included in the purchase price. So that means that it's something that the corporation doesn't pay for, or it's a benefit that isn't included in the price of the product. So some examples of that would be particles of soot that are released by factories that are affecting the health of people in the region. So those people have to pay medical costs and miss out on days of work because of the poor air quality. But the factory that's emitting the soot or the air pollution isn't paying for the cleanup cost of that. They aren't paying for the medical expenses, and that price isn't included in the cost of their product. Deforestation is another example. If the deforestation results in an increased amount of sediment in rivers or a decreased water quality, the company that's doing the deforestation, that's cutting down the trees, is not including the price of cleaning up the sediment or improving water quality in the cost of the products that they make from those trees. So those are externalities. So let's take a brief look at quantity and price, or the supply and demand curves. So the idea with supply and demand is that a manufacturer will increase supply until they reach an equilibrium point where the supply equals the demand and gives you a certain specific price and a certain amount of quantity, a certain quantity of that product that they're making. And in an ideal world, manufacturers will come to find this, relationship between quantity and price sort of on their own. It kind of happens mystically and magically, and they do that by reaching the best, cheapest price that they can charge and still make the profit that they want to without affecting consumer demand. Now, when we start to include externalities, we see this supply and demand curve shift a little bit. So what happens is we move from the original point, equilibrium point E, to the new equilibrium point E1, which is a little bit farther along that curve. So when the price increases, the supply decreases. And so as we move back along the demand curve, the demand line, we see a new line for supply. Basically, what this graph is trying to say is that when externalities are included in the price of a product, then the demand for that product will generally decrease and the supply of that product will generally decrease as well. So the manufacturer will not be able to make as much of that product because there will be a higher price. Now that's why, it explains pretty clearly why most companies don't like to include externalities in the cost of their product. They don't want to have to pay for pollution, cleanup. They don't want to have to pay for the medical costs of people affected by their products. So, because all of that would increase the cost that they have to pay and decrease their profits. Now, this brings us to something that isn't really touched on in the book, but is important to understand, and that's the difference between free trade and fair trade. So you'll hear a lot about this in modern news, the news cycle lately. We've got a lot of different people talking about trade agreements and how do we trade with China and what about NAFTA and that kind of stuff. I'm not an expert on this. Again, this is just environmental science. So if you want more details, I definitely recommend doing the research on your own. I'm going to give you a very simplified version of my understanding of free trade and fair trade. And there's definitely more than one side of the story. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to go look it up. So free trade is typically considered when trade between nations is free of tariffs. So tariffs are import and export charges that are, different nations will add on to the price of a product. Like if, a manufacturer from Mexico wants to sell their products in the United States, and the United States wants to avoid having those products compete with their own products, they would impose tariffs. And that tariff that's not considered free trade. It is free trade when we say, okay, there's not going to be any tariffs. So a product made in Mexico can be sold and imported into the United States and sold in the United States without any extra charges. Now, one of the results of this is that as long as free trade agreements exist, manufacturers will go to wherever they can pay the workers the least. So if you can manufacture your product in Mexico, paying your workers only $5 an hour, when in the United States you have to pay them $10 an hour, and there are no tariffs because we have a free trade agreement with Mexico. So if there are no tariffs, then of course companies are going to make their products in Mexico whenever possible. That's just an example. So lower wages for workers is one possible result of free trade. Another one could be unfair hiring or firing practices if manufacturing and jobs are moved to countries that don't have as many regulations on labor. We can also see poor working conditions, and goods are being exchanged between countries very cheaply. So one example of this is corn. Corn can be grown in the United States for cheaper, actually, than it can be grown in Mexico because of the scale of which manufacturers are making, the big agribusiness is making growing corn. And so when there are no tariffs, American corn can be sold in Mexico for much cheaper than Mexicans can grow their own corn. And so we've seen, as a result of NAFTA, a lot of corn farmers in Mexico going out of business and unable to continue farming on their land because they're being undersold by American corn. And part of the reason that American corn is so cheap is because the government pays money to the corn farmers to keep the prices down. So that gets into a whole bigger problem of government subsidies, but it's something worth paying attention to. Now, not the opposite of free trade, but an alternative to free trade is something called fair trade. And you can buy fair trade coffee, you can buy fair trade clothing, fair trade jewelry. Basically, the idea with fair trade is that the employees who are working for whatever company it is are getting paid fair, livable wages, which means that they're not earning $1 a day. They can actually make a decent living in their country. The companies agree to abide by fair hiring practices. They agree to maintain good working conditions, and they agree to protect their workers from toxins and other environmental harm. So if you want to try and find companies that are doing the right thing, support fair trade. That would be my recommendation, because those companies are doing what they can to improve the conditions of workers, not just in the United States, but all around the world. All right, this brings us to another big economic topic, which is GDP and an alternative to GDP, which is GPI. So GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. I think those of you guys who have taken economics know that already. And the gross domestic product is the total value of all the goods and services that are produced by a country. So typically what we see, and we talked about this a little bit in class, is that when the GDP increases, we tend to see birth rate decrease. And the relationship between GDP and the environment is much more complex. We talked a little bit in class today about the Kuznets curve. Basically, as GDP increases to a certain point, environmental impact also increases. And then the belief of some environmental scientists is that past a certain point, the environmental impact begins to decrease again, because the additional wealth is going into doing things that are going to protect the environment, like green energy, pollution control, and things like that. Now, another way of measuring progress is called the GPI, which stands for the Genuine Progress Indicator. Now, this takes a lot of different things into account beyond just the value of goods and services produced. So this takes into account things like personal consumption, income distribution, higher education, resource depletion and pollution, and human health. So an interesting thing that you'll notice if you look in the book is that although our GDP in the United States has been increasing steadily for quite some time now, our GPI in the United States actually leveled off and hasn't increased in some number of years. And that's because although we are getting, by all appearances, our country is getting richer, we're not actually making any progress forward. We have a wider income distribution now than ever before. We have people definitely are experiencing resource depletion and pollution. Human health is not improving. So we've got some steps to take if we want to actually improve the lives for people in the United States. So I mentioned the Kuznets curve. You can see here that starting with the very lowest GDP on the left, as you increase a certain point, the environment gets worse. The increased environmental degradation. And then the theory is that at a certain point, the environment begins to improve as that additional wealth is going into to things that will actually protect the environment reforestation, pollution control, good policies that help maintain habitat, things like that. So let's talk about another option. This is something that's being done in other countries. We saw the video Don't Panic by Hans Rosling. This concept of microlending is one of the things I'm sure he would have recommended as a way to help the extremely poor get out of poverty, for the people who are willing to work hard and want to do what's right. So basically, the way that microlending works is that a very small loan is given to an individual in a developing country. And this loan could be, maybe just $100, $300. We're not talking about a lot of money. It's the kind of money that an individual in the United States would be able to give. Maybe not a high school student, but, a person who's working their job, they're working full time, or maybe they're working part time and putting some aside. These kinds of small loans can be pretty easily made. And so what happens is that individual in the developing country purchases some inexpensive items. We saw in the video that could be something like a bicycle. It could also be something like a sewing machine, or in the picture here you can see like a wheelbarrow and a hoe and a rake. And so because of those inexpensive items, there is an increased productivity and an increased quality of life and an increased income for that person. Now, as their income increases, they repay that small loan back to whoever gave them the loan, but they get to keep those products. And so this leads to huge environmental benefits, actually. If the microlending is done properly, there's also increased education done along with that. Oftentimes, microlending is designed to empower women, so that can, by giving women something to work towards, they can encourage women to have a lower fertility rate through that education, and they can also encourage sound environmental practices. So there's a development of a local market. They don't use as much fuel to transport goods, and people are able to then produce the goods they need in the regions where it's needed. And so this idea of microlending really supports entrepreneurs, which is fantastic. It helps those people who just need a little bit of a boost to get themselves out of extreme poverty. And a lot of times this small initial loan is enough to change an entire family's life. All right, so let's talk a little bit about ecological economics. So in traditional economics, all of those arrows at the beginning are all inputs, and they all just kind of go pointing one way. And there's this sort of big giant arrow in the middle that has waste as the output. And in ecological economics, the idea is we don't have this one-way flow, because that's unsustainable. We can't keep using Earth's resources up and just pushing them through the system. It's not going to end well for us, because we're using resources faster than they're being depleted. So in ecological economics, what we try to do is we place value on natural capital. So natural capital are things like the natural resources, like intact forests, clean water, clean air, mineral resources, things that may not always be valued in traditional economics, but functioning ecosystems are valued in ecological economics. And so our inputs, in addition to just having the raw materials, we also have energy, and we also have ecosystem services. Now, ecosystem services are these services that are provided by fully intact ecosystems. And these would be things like wetlands filtering water for us, or trees producing oxygen and helping to reduce pollutants in the air, things like that. So in ecological economics, we do still have our investment of natural capital, but we also try through the production and consumption process, instead of just having our output be waste, we try to have recycling of the waste stream to bring some of that raw material back into the production and consumption cycle. And so this, the idea would be that we minimize that red arrow for waste as much as possible, and we maximize that green arrow to keep our ecosystems functioning as well as possible, and make sure that we're not damaging the systems that support us. All right, this brings us to another section in the book that talks about different environmental worldviews. This brings up this idea that people may be protecting the environment for different reasons, or may care about the environment for different reasons. Your book details 3 different worldviews, and I'm just going to run through them really quickly. I don't know that they usually appear on the AP test, but it's worth knowing so that you can understand who you're talking with and why. And then that also kind of helps when making arguments for why we should protect the environment, and that does occasionally show up in the FRQs. So the first environmental worldview is the anthropocentric worldview, and this worldview focuses on human welfare and human well-being. So it sounds like maybe that wouldn't include the environment, but within the anthropocentric worldview is this idea of stewardship, and that mentality basically says that the natural world requires protection, and as humans, it is our ethical responsibility to be good managers of the natural world. So we have a responsibility to protect the natural world because we are the sort of most advanced species on the planet. We're the ones who are causing all the damage, and then it also does help us it improves human well-being when we protect the environment as well. Now, the second worldview is the biocentric worldview, and this one says that humans are just one of many species that all have equal intrinsic value. So all life has value, and ecosystems themselves have instrumental value. So all life has value on its own just because it exists, and ecosystems have value, instrumental value, meaning that they're useful to humans. So that's why we should protect the environment. The final worldview is called the ecocentric worldview, which is an earth-centered view, and it says that we should not put demands on nature. So the world exists, nature exists, and humans should do everything they can to minimize their impact on the planet. We have no right to put demands on nature. We should not be taking from nature. So that's a much more extreme view as far as our relationship to nature. Rather than being a part of it, we're seen as separate from it and not allowed to touch. So you probably fall into one of these categories. Most people do, but there are other environmental worldviews you can research on your own if you're interested. All right, now that brings us to the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is very unpopular among some policymakers these days, but let me see if I can explain it all pretty quickly and concisely for you. Basically, the idea is that when we don't know what's going to happen, if we're not certain about the consequences of our actions, it's better to choose whatever alternative is known to be harmless. So for example, if we are trying to decide whether or not to use this new kind of pesticide that's been developed, and we don't have clear scientific results, like maybe the results are uncertain, or some of the tests show that this pesticide would be harmful and some show that it wouldn't be, we should err on the side of caution and say, let's not use it, because that's the alternative known to be harmless. So the benefit to this is that when the scientific evidence is uncertain, we use caution, which can prevent harm to people and the environment. So that's beneficial. It protects people, it protects the planet. We don't go using these things, going like, oh, it seems like it's safe. I guess maybe it will be. We haven't done all the tests yet, but let's try it. So we don't do that. The precautionary principle says we should err on the side of caution and not do anything rash, not do anything when we don't know exactly what the results are going to be. Now, people's objection to this is that this could hinder economic progress and human development, because we're basically always going to be sitting on our hands going, well, we don't know. The science isn't clear, so let's not do anything. So certain people would say that the precautionary principle is too limiting and too restricting, and that we ought to be willing to take a few more risks for the sake of major advances. So again, you can find yourself somewhere in between probably on this. It's worth knowing that this is a principle that's discussed among nations at the highest levels of policy, and the debate still rages about where we should fall on the precautionary principle. All right, there's a few important agencies. They're outlined in your book. I'm not going to take the time right now to go over all of them, except to say that the United Nations is an international organization. We have many, many nations that are members of it, and it basically oversees things that affect us globally. So their environment program, development program, World Bank, World Health Organization, all of these different agencies that act globally are important agencies as far as regulating the actions between countries, helping to manage things that take place in international waters and things like that. And then in the United States, we have a few important agencies. For the sake of our class, the most important one is the Environmental Protection Agency. They're the ones that are charged with protecting the natural resources in the United States. And that does, in some cases, include human health. It includes protecting us from environmental harm from companies or industries. That also includes protecting endangered species. So they oversee quite a lot of stuff. We also have the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, or OSHA, and the Department of Energy, which oversees our energy programs in the United States. If you want to know more about them, you can go read your book. All right, so we have a couple ways that we measure our progress towards sustainability. We have the Human Development Index and the Human Poverty Index. Your book does a pretty good job of explaining the Human Development Index, not so much the Human Poverty Index. Again, these will not be on the AP test most likely, but it's worth knowing how sustainability is measured, because you'll definitely see these concepts on the AP test: life expectancy, standard of living, things like that. So the Human Development Index measures how well countries are doing based on their life expectancy, based on their literacy rates. So how is their knowledge and education level on average, and then based on what the standard of living is in that country. The Human Poverty Index is similar. It's basically designed to measure what proportion of a population is suffering in a country that has a high Human Development Index. So, for example, in the United States, we have a pretty high score on the Human Development Index, and the Human Poverty Index would measure what proportion of a population is not doing well in a country like ours. So the Poverty Index lets us know how much of our population in the U.S. is living in poverty, is living in conditions that would be considered substandard. So this doesn't apply to countries that are where everyone in the country is poor, the less developed countries. The Human Poverty Index really only applies to the more developed nations. All right, finally, let's go on to talking about how we legislate sustainability. How do governments try to get companies and people to do the right thing as far as protecting the environment? There are two main approaches that are explained in your textbook. The first one is called the command and control approach. Basically, this is pollution control, and it's done through regulation and enforcement. So things like you're only allowed to emit so many pounds of sulfur dioxide, per day. And then you say, okay, well, you've emitted more than you were allowed to, so now you're going to get a fine. Or things like you're not allowed to dump that hazardous waste in this lake. Okay, you did dump a hazardous waste in the lake. Now we're going to make you pay. You're going to have to pay a fine for it and help with the cleanup. So that would be the command and control approach. The government commands what they want to have happen, and then they control behavior using regulation and fines. The incentive-based approach tries to get companies to do the right thing because they want to, or tries to make it more beneficial financially for them to. So they will, the government, again, would offer incentives to companies for lowering their emissions. Maybe, if you hit such and such a target by next week or by next month or by next year, then you would receive this kind of like tax benefit or a one-time payment of some kind of money or something like that. And typically the incentive-based approach is based on profits and benefits. So you could think of the incentive-based approach as the carrot and the command and control approach as the stick. So you try and get companies to do the right thing by offering them these, nice, tasty incentives. And then when they don't do the right thing, you beat them up with your fines and your regulations. All right, finally, we have environmental justice. I think we're almost to the end of this. So environmental justice, we talked about this briefly in class, but environmental justice basically says that there is a disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards for people of lower income. So basically, hazardous waste facilities, this would be an example, are often built in communities with minorities and or lower income residents. Hazardous waste facilities could include factories that are generating hazardous waste or air pollution. Could be things like oil refineries, chemical factories, power plants like coal burning power plants. It could also be like landfills and things like that. Basically, all of those things together we call LULUs. The abbreviation is locally undesirable land uses. So things that occur locally, they're not wanted, and they occur on the land, open land in a particular area. So up in Torrance, where I used to live, there's a Dow chemical factory. There's a think it's an ExxonMobil refinery, and those things are located right next to a school. So when there was an explosion at the refinery, they had to shut the school down. And in exchange for that, the refinery donated some money to the school district to kind of say, hey, we're sorry for, having an explosion at our factory and polluting the air around here and making you shut down your school. So those kinds of things, though, tend to happen in communities with minorities or lower income residents, not in communities that are occupied by the wealthy. So when we talk about environmental equity, we're actually going for the fair distribution of resources on Earth. So helping reduce what the United States uses so that there's more available for other people and things like that. And that brings us to the end of this lecture. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. If you have any questions, let me know, and we will see you in